An elderly woman with tired eyes and a trembling hand asks the cashier if there's any chance for a small discount, only to have the manager openly laugh at her, mocking her pennies in front of everyone. "People like you shouldn't be shopping here," he sneers as the crowd snickers, casting her aside like she's nothing. Little do they know, in a few weeks, she'll own the very store where they humiliated her, and she'll make changes they'll never forget. Watch what happens when the woman they scorn takes control and turns the tables in a way no one saw coming. Martha sat at her small kitchen table, counting the coins in her hands with slow, careful movements. The table was covered with a worn tablecloth, and beside her was an old photo in a simple frame, a picture of a young woman who looked a lot like her. Martha paused, gently touching the frame, her weathered face softening as she whispered, "I'm doing the best I can, honey." The quiet of her home felt thick and heavy, the kind of silence that settles after years of hard work and sacrifice. Around her, everything was modest but tidy, telling a story of a woman who knew how to make the most of little. With a sigh, Martha looked over at a small notebook filled with columns of numbers. Her life was laid out in careful calculations: the price of groceries, her utility bills, a few expenses here and there for things she wanted, but never allowed herself to buy. Every penny had a purpose, and she made sure to stretch each one as far as it would go. She knew people laughed at her frugality, her habit of asking for discounts or clipping coupons. It didn't bother her much. She had always had to be practical, even when others didn't understand. But deep down, it stung a little when people treated her requests with impatience or even mockery. The next morning, Martha gathered her list and walked to the small grocery store a few blocks from her house. The bell jingled as she stepped inside, and she greeted the cashier, a young woman who barely looked up as Martha entered. She moved slowly down the aisles, carefully selecting a few items and checking prices against her list, hoping she wouldn't have to put anything back. When she reached the register, she asked softly if she could get a small discount on one of the items, just a few cents off to help her balance things out. Behind the counter, Rick, the store manager, snorted as he watched her. "You're always asking for a little off here and there, aren't you?" he muttered under his breath, his words meant to be heard. Martha's face showed no reaction, but a flicker of hurt passed through her eyes. She held her head high, ignoring his sarcasm. Another customer nearby chuckled and shook his head, and she caught the whispers, the quiet laughter. But she kept her composure. She'd heard it all before, people thinking she was being cheap or troublesome. They didn't know her story, didn't understand why every penny mattered. She simply replied, "One day things will be different," and left without a word more. When she got home, Martha sat down in her chair, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. She looked at her savings jar and her notebook, the careful planning and rationing that had guided her for years. As she sat there, memories flooded back, working long hours to support her daughter, taking on extra shifts when the bills piled up, the quiet sacrifices that no one ever saw. The next day, Martha returned to the grocery store with a determination that was stronger than usual. She moved quietly among the aisles, keeping her head down as she picked up her usual groceries, her mind occupied with thoughts of stretching her limited budget. As she approached the counter, she overheard a conversation between Rick, the store manager, and another man, dressed sharply and carrying a briefcase. Their voices were low, but Martha could catch enough to understand what was being discussed. "It's only a matter of time before we have to close up," Rick was saying, sounding frustrated. "The owner's talking about selling the place. Too much competition, not enough profit. This place has no future." The man beside him sighed, glancing around the store as if he could already see it empty and forgotten. "Well, unless someone's willing to pay for it outright, I don't see much hope. Nobody's going to invest in an old store like this, Rick. Not worth it." Martha's eyes narrowed as she processed their words, a thought sparking in her mind. She continued with her shopping, pretending not to have heard, but her heart beat faster with each step. Could it really be possible that the store she'd come to so often, the store that had denied her small discounts but was a central part of her community, was about to be sold? The thought was both unsettling and strangely intriguing. When she reached the register, she looked at Rick and the man, who were now casting annoyed glances her way, as if she were interrupting their conversation just by being there. Rick gave her the usual dismissive look and rang up her items without a word. But instead of her usual quiet departure, Martha decided to ask, her voice soft but steady, "Is it true the store might close down?" Rick gave a slight shrug, his expression hard. "What difference does it make to you?" he scoffed. "It's business. This place isn't worth anything anymore." He looked at her as if she were part of the problem, as if her habit of looking for small discounts made her somehow responsible for the store's troubles. Martha didn't say anything in response, but as she took her bags and left, the wheels in her mind were turning faster than they ever had. She thought back to her savings, the careful budgeting she had done over the years. It wasn't much by any standard, but maybe, just maybe, it could be enough to make a difference. She walked home in silence, her steps a little lighter, her gaze focused ahead, the seed of an idea taking root. That evening, Martha sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by her notebook, calculator, and a few neatly stacked piles of cash. The light from the old lamp cast a warm glow over the table, illuminating her notes and her thoughtful expression. She thumbed through the pages, going over each line of savings she had carefully recorded over the years. Small but steady amounts she'd put aside from every check, a few coins here and there, a habit formed from years of making do with little. She knew her savings weren't much by most standards, but as she did the calculations over and over, a quiet certainty began to build. If she could add up everything, even the small inheritance from her late sister that she had never touched, she might just have enough to make an offer on the store. It felt almost absurd to think about, but the more she considered it, the more the idea grew stronger, like a spark catching fire. This store had been a part of her neighborhood for years, and though its owner had never respected her as a customer, she knew how much the community depended on it. If it closed, people like her, those who barely scraped by, would have nowhere close to go for essentials. As she worked, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. She saw herself as a young woman, working late nights and early mornings, barely getting by but always finding a way to stretch every dollar. Back then, she dreamed of opening a small store of her own, a place where people like her wouldn't have to feel ashamed to ask for a bit of help. The idea had drifted away as life moved on and responsibilities grew. But tonight, it felt as if that old dream had never really left her. The thought of buying the store didn't feel like a plan anymore. It felt like a calling. If she could make it happen, she could create the kind of place she'd always wanted. A place where respect and dignity came before profit. She knew she wasn't getting any younger, and the risks were real. But something inside her stirred with a quiet strength she hadn't felt in years. Martha took a deep breath, her mind racing with the possibilities. There were still questions and details she would need to figure out, but one thing was certain. This was her chance to turn the tables. And for the first time in a long time, she went to bed that night feeling something close to hope. The next morning, Martha made her way to the bank. She walked slowly but purposefully, clutching her old leather purse tightly. She hadn't been to the bank in years for anything more than her routine transactions, and today she felt an unusual nervousness. The idea of owning the store felt bold, almost too bold. But the thought had taken root, and she couldn't let it go. There was a small voice inside her, one that had always played it safe, urging her to reconsider. But her heart was louder, reminding her that this could be her one chance to make a real difference, not only for herself, but for her entire community. When she arrived, she explained her situation to a banker named Mr. Henson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who listened attentively as she outlined her plan. Mr. Henson seemed surprised but not dismissive. As he looked over her savings account and inheritance records, his expression softened, and he leaned forward. "Martha, I have to say, it's not every day we see a proposal like this," he said gently, giving her a small smile. "But you've built a solid nest egg over the years, and if you're serious, I believe you could actually make this work. It's a risk, no doubt, but with the right support, it's possible." Martha felt her heart leap. She had come here with the faint hope of a green light, but hearing it from someone else, hearing that this dream wasn't impossible, brought tears to her eyes. She quickly brushed them away, nodding with determination. Mr. Henson spent the next hour going over the options with her, discussing loan possibilities and explaining the steps she'd need to take to make an offer. She absorbed every detail, her mind sharp, soaking in the information like a sponge. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, exhilarating. This was more than a plan. It was a chance to take control of her life in a way she never had before. As she left the bank that day, Martha felt lighter, almost as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. The familiar streets seemed brighter, the passers-by friendlier. She noticed things she'd never paid attention to before: the cracked sidewalk, the peeling paint on the lampposts, the way children skipped and laughed on their way to school. This was her neighborhood, her people, and she was about to do something that could change their lives too. She spent the next few days gathering everything she needed, speaking with people she trusted, and preparing herself for what would come. At night, she sat with her notebook, scribbling out ideas for changes she'd make if the store became hers. She dreamed of creating a place where people could shop with dignity, a store that didn't look down on anyone for needing a break or asking for a fair price. In her mind, she envisioned a bright, welcoming place that was filled with laughter and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive atmosphere the store had now. Finally, after days of preparation and thought, she knew she was ready. It was time to make her offer. On a rainy morning, Martha walked back to the store, her heart beating a steady rhythm as she rehearsed what she would say to the owner. She had arranged a meeting with him after learning he was looking to sell, and though her nerves tingled, her resolve was unshakable. She entered the store with her head held high, scanning the aisles that had once made her feel small and judged. Today was different. Today she was here not as a shopper, but as someone ready to take control. The owner, Mr. Gibbons, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a perpetually disgruntled expression, sat behind the counter when she arrived. He glanced at her with mild surprise, as though he couldn't imagine what she might want. In his mind, she was just another customer, a penny pincher, one of those regulars who always looked for bargains and seemed to hold up his line. "Well, Martha," he said, eyeing her skeptically, "what brings you here today? Need another discount?" Martha felt her cheeks flush, but she maintained her composure. "Actually, Mr. Gibbons," she began, her voice steady, "I'm here because I'd like to discuss the sale of your store." He blinked, the skepticism in his eyes deepening. "You're serious?" he asked, a bit of condescension slipping into his voice. "Yes, I am," she replied, meeting his gaze firmly. "I understand you're looking to sell. I've been a customer here for years, and I think this store could be something special with the right care and respect for our community. I'm prepared to make you an offer." Mr. Gibbons chuckled, clearly amused by what he thought was a ludicrous idea. "You?" he scoffed. "No offense, Martha, but this isn't exactly something you can bargain on. We're talking real money, not the little bits you scrounge for here and there." Martha held her ground, ignoring the jab. "I've saved for years," she said quietly. "And I'm not asking for favors. I have the funds and a plan. Now I'd like to discuss terms if you're willing." Mr. Gibbons looked at her, a flicker of surprise flashing in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with a casual shrug. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp as he sized her up. "All right then," he muttered, his tone guarded. "Let's hear what you've got." Martha laid out her offer with a steady confidence that surprised even herself. She spoke clearly, outlining her intentions, and emphasized her commitment to keeping the store open for the community. Mr. Gibbons listened, his expression shifting from amusement to mild interest. Despite his dismissive attitude, he couldn't deny that her proposal was sound. By the time she finished, he sat silently, thinking it over. Martha felt her pulse quicken, the air in the room thick with anticipation. She knew this moment was pivotal. His answer would either shatter her hopes or bring her one step closer to a lifelong dream. After a long pause, he sighed, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "Well, Martha," he said finally, his tone begrudging but respectful. "It's not what I expected, but I think we might be able to work something out." Relief washed over her, but she didn't let it show. She simply nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet, powerful joy. She had done it. Against all odds, she had taken the first step toward transforming the store and herself. The deal wasn't yet finalized, but she could feel the future unfolding, one where she could finally give back to the community that had shaped her life. Over the next few weeks, Martha found herself swept into a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and plans. There was a lot to learn, more than she had ever imagined. From negotiating final terms with Mr. Gibbons to understanding supplier contracts and sorting out licenses, Martha was faced with a new world of responsibilities. She spent long hours reading, asking questions, and absorbing every detail, refusing to let her inexperience hold her back. It was exhausting, but she felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. In her quiet moments, she thought of the changes she'd make once the store was officially hers. Her dreams were simple, but powerful. She imagined an open, inviting space, free from the dismissive looks and sneers she had endured as a customer. She wanted her store to be a place where people felt seen, respected, and welcome, regardless of their income or background. She pictured herself behind the counter, greeting each customer with a warm smile, treating them as more than just transactions. It was a vision that kept her going through the many hurdles she encountered, giving her the strength to push forward. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of meetings, Martha walked back to her neighborhood, the fresh autumn air filling her lungs as she passed familiar houses and street corners. As she rounded the corner to the store, she saw a group of neighborhood children laughing and playing on the sidewalk. She stopped for a moment, watching them, her heart swelling with pride. These kids deserved a community where they could grow up feeling valued, and she wanted to be part of building that. The store was only one piece of that vision, but it was a start. Finally, the day came when all the paperwork was signed, the last formalities completed. She was handed the keys to the store in a quiet ceremony at the local notary's office, and as she clutched them in her hand, a rush of emotion overcame her. These keys were more than metal. They were a symbol of everything she had worked for, of years of saving, of moments of resilience and sacrifice. Holding them felt like holding her dreams. When she walked through the store's doors for the first time as its official owner, she stood still for a long moment, taking it all in. The aisles, the shelves, the hum of the old refrigerator, all of it was now hers. She knew there was a long road ahead, but for the first time in her life, she felt a powerful sense of purpose and belonging. This store would be hers to reshape, to renew, and to make something that would lift the entire community. As news spread through the neighborhood that Martha had bought the store, reactions varied. Some people were pleasantly surprised, while others, like Rick, were outright skeptical. Rick had stayed on as an employee, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation each time he looked at her. To him, it was as if she didn't belong behind the counter, as if she were somehow pretending to be something she wasn't. He often muttered under his breath about her crazy ideas, like lowering prices or showing extra patience with customers who needed a bit of help. One evening, after Martha had spent hours reorganizing shelves and restocking inventory, Rick confronted her. "Martha," he started, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "I don't get it. You really think cutting prices and letting people haggle is going to keep this place afloat? It's not a charity, you know." Martha looked up from her work, calm but resolute. "Rick," she replied, her voice steady, "I've seen people struggle to make ends meet for too long. I know what it feels like to be looked down on because you need a little help. This store is going to be different," Rick snorted, crossing his arms. "Different? Yeah, you're right about that. You're going to run it into the ground." She felt a flicker of irritation but chose her words carefully. "Maybe you don't understand yet, Rick," she said quietly. "But I'm not here just to make a profit. I'm here to build a place where everyone can feel welcome, where nobody has to feel embarrassed for asking for a little kindness." Rick rolled his eyes and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Martha watched him go, her resolve only growing stronger. She knew she was up against skepticism, not just from Rick but from many others who saw her as just an elderly woman trying to play business owner. But she also knew she had something far more valuable than money or experience. She had a heart full of purpose, and the memories of every person who had once felt small and humiliated in places just like this. The following day, she took her vision a step further. She put up a handwritten sign near the entrance that read, "Everyone deserves dignity. Discounts for those who need them." It was simple, but it conveyed the heart of her mission. As customers came in and noticed the sign, many were touched, nodding in appreciation as they read it. For some, it was the first time they'd ever seen a store prioritize their humanity over their wallet. Throughout the day, people trickled in, sharing quiet words of gratitude, some even telling her how much the changes meant to them. One young mother struggling to buy groceries thanked her with tears in her eyes, saying, "No one's ever cared like this before." Martha felt her heart swell with pride and purpose. She was beginning to see the ripple effects of her actions, each one bringing her closer to the community she had dreamed of creating. As she closed up that evening, she stood in the empty store, looking at the aisles, the shelves, and the flickering lights overhead. It wasn't much yet, just a simple store in a small neighborhood. But to her, it was everything. It was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for everyone who walked through those doors. Martha's changes at the store began to attract more attention as word spread around the neighborhood. People started coming by, not just to shop, but to see if the rumors were true. Was it really possible that someone had taken over the store and actually cared about making things better for regular folks? For years, customers had walked those aisles, forced to choose between overpriced basics and the dismissive attitudes of employees like Rick. But now, as they came in, they were greeted by a warmth and kindness that felt almost revolutionary. One afternoon, a man in his 70s, stooped and thin, shuffled into the store with a wary look. He picked up a can of beans and eyed the price, clearly debating if he could afford it. Martha noticed him from behind the counter and walked over with a gentle smile. "Good afternoon," she greeted him. "Anything I can help you with today?" The man hesitated, glancing down at his shoes. "Just looking, ma'am," he mumbled, clearly embarrassed. He placed the can back on the shelf, shaking his head as he prepared to leave. Martha gently placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Why don't you take that with you?" she said softly. "It's on the house today, and if you need anything else, just let me know." The man looked at her in disbelief, his eyes misting over. "Ma'am, I don't want charity," he said, his voice cracking. Times are tough, that's all." "It's not charity," she replied, her tone warm and understanding. "We're here to look out for each other. Just come back when you can, all right?" The man nodded, overcome with emotion, and took the can with a quiet, "Thank you," before shuffling out. Moments like this began happening more frequently, each one reinforcing Martha's commitment to making the store a sanctuary for those in need. Her customers started seeing her, not just as a store owner, but as a friend, someone they could count on when things got hard. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. Rick's frustration continued to simmer, his resentment growing as he saw Martha handing out discounts and extending credit to people he thought were taking advantage. One evening, after the store had closed, he finally confronted her again. "You're going to drive this place into the ground, Martha," he said bluntly, folding his arms as he watched her balance the day's earnings. "Giving things away like that, you're just setting yourself up for failure. No one runs a business like this." Martha looked up, her face calm but firm. "Rick, I know this isn't the way you do things, but this isn't just a business to me. It's a chance to give back to people who've been struggling. I've been in their shoes and I know what it feels like to go without." Rick shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "People are just going to take advantage of you. And when they do, don't come crying to me." Martha's eyes softened. She knew Rick's attitude was rooted in years of seeing business as a harsh, competitive world where every cent counted and kindness was a weakness. but she couldn't let his cynicism sway her. "Maybe they will," she replied quietly, "but I'd rather take that risk than turn away someone who needs help. This store is about more than money, Rick. It's about giving people a sense of hope." Rick scoffed, muttering under his breath as he grabbed his things and left. But Martha stayed behind, tidying up the aisles and thinking about the encounters she'd had that day. Each person she'd helped had left her feeling a little more certain that she was on the right path, even if others couldn't understand. As she locked up that night, she gazed at the small "Everyone Deserves Dignity" sign she'd posted by the entrance. To most, it was just a sign with simple words. But to her, it was a promise that she'd continue no matter the challenges to make this store a place of kindness, a small haven in a world that often felt too harsh. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs, and walked home with a sense of peace. The changes Martha had made were starting to show their impact beyond the store itself. The neighborhood began to feel her influence as more people came in to shop, often stopping to chat or share their gratitude. Local families, elderly neighbors, and even young single mothers saw Martha as more than just a store owner. She had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that kindness still had a place in their community. Children who would normally wait outside shyly wandered in, drawn by the warmth they could feel as soon as they entered. And Martha often kept a bowl of small candies at the counter just for them. One afternoon, a woman named Claire came into the store with her young daughter, looking worn and tired. Martha recognized her from the neighborhood and noticed how Claire struggled to fill her basket with the basics. She kept picking up items, calculating carefully, and then putting some back. The young girl beside her, no older than 6, looked up with big, hopeful eyes every time her mother hesitated, only to see her mother shake her head, a quiet sorrow in her face. Martha's heart ached as she watched, and after a moment she walked over to them, picking up one of the items Claire had put back, a loaf of bread. She handed it to Claire with a gentle smile. "Please take it," Martha said, her voice kind and reassuring. "And whatever else you need. Today, it's on me." Claire's eyes filled with tears, her face a mix of surprise and gratitude. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. We'll manage." But Martha gently placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze with quiet strength. "I know you will, Claire. But everyone needs a little help sometimes. Just come back when you can. And remember, you're always welcome here." Claire nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and her daughter looked up at Martha with a wide, innocent smile. "Thank you, Miss Martha," the little girl said softly, hugging the loaf of bread close to her chest. Martha's heart warmed, and she felt the weight of her decision lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of having made a real difference. Later that evening, after Claire and her daughter had left, Rick approached Martha yet again, his frustration now verging on open disbelief. He had watched her interactions with customers all day, each one chipping away at the rigid, profit-driven mindset he had grown up with. To him, this kindness and generosity seemed like a dangerous gamble. "Why do you keep doing this, Martha?" he demanded, his tone exasperated. "You're practically giving things away. You're not making any money with all these favors. Do you even know what you're doing?" Martha paused, turning to face him, her expression calm but unwavering. "Rick, I know it might look foolish to you," she said, choosing her words with care. "But sometimes it's not about making money. Sometimes it's about making a difference. People need to know there's a place where they're seen, where they're cared for. I don't expect you to understand it right now, but one day you might." Rick's frustration simmered as he looked at her, clearly struggling to comprehend her perspective. To him, business was simple: profits and losses, gains and debts. But Martha's way was something else entirely, a kind of faith in people he couldn't yet grasp. As he stormed out of the store, muttering about reckless generosity, Martha watched him go with a quiet, knowing smile. She wasn't angry or discouraged by his words. Instead, she felt a deeper sense of purpose, a clarity that her path was the right one, even if few understood it. She walked back to the front of the store, taking a moment to gaze around at the small, modest space she had transformed. Each shelf, each aisle, each small, thoughtful gesture she had added to the store represented a piece of her heart, her belief that people deserved a place where kindness came first. And as she looked at the door, she felt a quiet pride, knowing that the store was no longer just a business. It was a beacon of hope for anyone who needed it. As the days went by, Martha's vision for the store began to take even deeper root within the community. Her efforts were transforming the store into more than just a place to buy groceries. It was becoming a gathering spot, a safe haven where people felt valued and respected. Customers lingered longer, chatting with each other, sharing stories, and even offering Martha small tokens of gratitude. A homemade loaf of bread, a jar of jam, fresh flowers picked from their gardens. It was as though her kindness had sparked a ripple effect, encouraging others to give in their own ways. But one day something unexpected happened. A woman named Lorraine, known around the neighborhood for her sharp tongue and unwillingness to trust anyone, entered the store. She was a regular, but rarely spoke more than a few clipped words, often giving Martha a skeptical glance as if waiting for the catch behind her kindness. Lorraine walked to the counter with her usual reserved manner, glancing around at the other customers who greeted Martha warmly. After a pause, she leaned in close to Martha, lowering her voice. "I've been watching you," she said, her tone cautious but curious. "You keep giving people breaks, letting them walk out with things they can't pay for. Most business owners would never do that. You're not worried they'll take advantage?" Martha looked at Lorraine with a gentle smile, her gaze steady and kind. "People are good, Lorraine," she replied softly. "Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them. I'd rather help someone who's struggling than turn them away because I think they'll take advantage. Most of the time, they come back when they can. And when they don't, well, I trust they have their reasons." Lorraine studied Martha's face, clearly wrestling with the idea. She shook her head slowly, as if unable to understand how someone could be so trusting. But something softened in her eyes. "Maybe it's the way you say it," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's the way you make people feel like they're worth something." Without another word, Lorraine handed Martha her money, took her groceries, and left. But as she reached the door, she hesitated, turning back just for a moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, her tone carrying a sincerity Martha hadn't heard from her before. Then she left, disappearing into the crowd outside. That evening, as Martha locked up, she thought about Lorraine's words. She knew her way of running the store was unconventional, even risky. But every time she helped someone, every time she saw relief or gratitude light up someone's face, she knew it was worth it. To her, the real value of the store wasn't in the profits it could generate, but in the lives it could touch. As she walked home, Martha passed by small groups of people chatting on street corners, a few children playing hopscotch, and an elderly couple sitting on their porch. Each familiar face seemed to carry a warmth that hadn't been there before. It was as if the neighborhood itself was beginning to change, its spirit growing lighter, more connected. Her store was a part of that, she realized, a place that reminded people of their shared humanity and the power of compassion. And in that moment, Martha felt a profound sense of purpose. She wasn't just running a store, she was building something far more meaningful. Over time, Martha's store began to draw attention from neighboring communities. Word of her unusual approach spread, and people started traveling from further away just to experience the welcoming atmosphere she had created. Her store became known as a place where kindness was the currency, and those in need could find a little bit of relief, even if it was just in the form of a discounted loaf of bread or a few words of encouragement. The change wasn't just in the customers, but in the staff as well. Even Rick, who had once scoffed at her ideals, began to notice the difference, though he kept his skepticism close. One afternoon, as Martha was arranging a new display near the entrance, a young man in his 20s came in, looking nervous and out of place. His clothes were worn, and he hesitated at the threshold, scanning the store as if uncertain whether he belonged. Martha noticed him immediately and gave him a warm smile, beckoning him in. "Come on in, honey," she said gently. "Take your time. Let me know if you need help with anything." The The young man seemed taken aback by her kindness. After a moment, he nodded and slowly made his way through the aisles, picking up a few essentials: bread, some canned food, and a small carton of milk. As he reached the counter, he fumbled with his wallet, looking embarrassed as he counted out what little he had. Martha could see his face tighten with worry as he realized he didn't have enough. Without missing a beat, Martha leaned over the counter and spoke softly. "How about I cover the rest today?" she offered. "You can pay me back next time or whenever you're able. No rush." The young man's eyes filled with gratitude, and he looked at her, struggling to find words. "Thank you. Thank you," he managed, his voice cracking. He looked down, gathering himself before adding, "I've been going through a rough time. Didn't think there was anyone out there who'd help a stranger like this." Martha gave him a reassuring smile. "You're not a stranger," she replied gently. "You're part of our community now. Just come back when you can and take care of yourself in the meantime. That's what matters." The young man nodded, taking his bag with newfound hope in his eyes. He glanced back at Martha one last time before leaving, clearly moved by the kindness he had found in her store. As he walked out, Rick, who had been observing the entire exchange, shook his head in disbelief. Once the young man was gone, Rick turned to Martha, struggling to hold back his frustration. "You can't keep doing this, Martha. You're letting people walk out with free groceries left and right. Sooner or later, this place is going to be in real trouble. I get that you want to help people, but this is a business. How do you expect to keep it running?" Martha looked at Rick with a calm that only experience and resilience could bring. "Rick, I understand your concerns, but I believe that when we treat people with kindness, it comes back to us in ways we can't always measure with money. That young man, he'll remember that someone cared enough to help him, and maybe one day he'll help someone else. That's worth more to me than a few dollars." Rick shook his head, but something in his expression had softened. He was beginning to see that there was more to Martha's vision than he had once thought, even if he couldn't fully understand it. It wasn't just about charity. It was about building a community, one small act of kindness at a time. As the day wound down and the store began to empty, Martha took a moment to reflect. She knew she was taking risks, knew that there would always be people like Rick who doubted her methods. But she also knew that what she was creating went beyond profit or losses. Her store was becoming a lifeline, a place where people could feel valued and supported, no matter what they were going through. And as she looked out at the quiet, dimly lit aisles, she felt a quiet pride settle over her. This was her life's work, not just selling goods, but restoring dignity, giving people a reason to believe in each other again. It was a humble mission, but it was hers, and she would see it through, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. As Martha continued to build her vision for the store, she began to notice small but powerful changes unfolding within the community. People no longer came by just for groceries. They came for connection, for encouragement, for a place that felt like home. They lingered in the aisles, chatting with neighbors they'd barely known before, sharing stories of hard times and hopes for better days. The store had become more than a business. It was a community center, a lifeline for people who had felt invisible for so long. One day, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne entered the store, moving slowly with the help of a cane. Her face was etched with lines of hardship and endurance, and her clothes, though neat, had clearly seen better days. Martha noticed her right away and walked over with a warm smile, offering her arm to help her to the nearest aisle. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded gratefully, her hands shaking as she leaned on Martha's steady arm. "I don't usually come out for groceries anymore," Mrs. Hawthorne murmured, her voice soft. "But I've been hearing about this place, about what you're doing here. People talk about you, Martha. They say you're giving folks hope." Martha blushed slightly, feeling humbled. "I just want people to feel welcome, Mrs. Hawthorne, to know they're seen, that they're valued," she replied softly. "If I can do that in some small way, then I'm doing what I'm meant to do." Mrs. Hawthorne looked at Martha with a deep, knowing gaze, her eyes moistening as she squeezed Martha's hand. You don't know what it means, dear. When you're old, alone and struggling to get by, it's easy to feel forgotten." She paused, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But walking in here today, I felt like someone remembered me." Martha swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Mrs. Hawthorne's words. She knew this was why she had taken on the store, why she had chosen to put kindness first, even when it made others question her decisions. Her heart swelled with gratitude, both for Mrs. Hawthorne's words and for the chance to make a difference, no matter how small. As Mrs. Hawthorne selected a few items with Martha's help, other customers watched the two women, moved by the quiet bond they shared. Martha's compassion was infectious, her store a reminder of simpler, kinder times. People who once rushed in and out without a word now exchanged warm greetings, offered to help each other carry bags, and sometimes even covered small purchases for one another. Martha's example had begun to inspire everyone, reminding them of the power of simple kindness in ways that extended beyond her store's walls. Later that same day, as Martha was preparing to close up, a middle-aged man named Joe came in, looking worn and tired. Joe was known around the neighborhood as a handyman, always busy with odd jobs to make ends meet. He rarely came to the store, often finding cheaper options farther away, but tonight he looked desperate. Martha noticed immediately and waved him over, her heart sinking as she took in his haggard expression. "Evening, Joe," she greeted him softly. "What can I help you with tonight?" Joe hesitated, looking down at his hands as he shuffled his feet. "Well, I ran out of work this month, Martha. It's been tough, and I hate to ask, but—" He trailed off, clearly struggling with the words. Martha sensed his pride battling with his need, and she reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Joe, you don't have to explain," she said, her voice gentle. "Just take what you need, all right? Pay me back whenever you can, no rush." Joe's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude, his weathered face softening. He managed to smile, though it wavered with emotion. "Thank you, Martha," he whispered, his voice thick. "I don't know what I'd do without folks like you." As Joe gathered a few essentials, Martha watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and pride. This was what the store was truly for, not profit, not competition, but people. For those like Joe, Mrs. Hawthorne, the young mother with her child, and the old man who'd barely had enough for a can of beans. Each person who came through her doors brought with them a story, and Martha felt it was her duty to honor those stories with compassion and understanding. When Joe left, Martha noticed Rick hovering nearby, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He approached her slowly, his face unusually serious, and for once he seemed to hold back the usual criticisms. Instead, he studied her in silence for a moment, almost as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You really believe in this, don't you?" he finally asked, his voice low. "In helping these people, even if it doesn't make sense to anyone else?" Martha nodded, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "I do, Rick. People come in here with heavy burdens, and if I can lighten that load, even a little, then I know I'm doing the right thing. This store isn't just about making ends meet, it's about showing people that someone cares." Rick looked down, shifting uncomfortably. He seemed to wrestle with her words, trying to reconcile her philosophy with everything he'd been taught about business. It's not how things are usually done," he murmured, almost to himself. "People don't usually look out for others like this." Martha smiled gently, her eyes warm. "Maybe that's why it matters so much, Rick. Because it's not the usual way. Because people don't expect it." She paused, watching him absorb her words. "Sometimes the things that matter most are the things we do without expecting anything in return." Rick nodded slowly, still visibly uncertain but clearly affected by what he had witnessed over the past weeks. Martha knew he didn't fully understand, but she could see a change in him, a softening as if he were beginning to question his own assumptions. Perhaps, she thought, he just needed time. As she finished locking up for the night, Martha felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. She was exhausted, yes, but It was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from knowing she had made a difference, however small. She looked back at the store one last time, her gaze lingering on the simple, "Everyone deserves dignity" sign by the entrance. It was more than just a slogan. It was a way of life, a promise to her community, a quiet rebellion against a world that so often forgot to see the humanity in each person. As she walked home under the fading light, she carried with her the stories of everyone she'd helped that day. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would do it all again tomorrow. Days turned into weeks, and Martha's store continued to blossom as a safe haven, a place where respect and kindness came before business. The changes Martha had sown took root in ways even she hadn't fully anticipated. Customers who once came to her seeking small acts of generosity had started returning to repay their debts, often with heartfelt words and little tokens of gratitude. The sense of community was growing stronger, and Martha could feel it every time she looked around at the familiar faces now filled with hope and warmth. One afternoon, a young woman named Sarah came into the store with her 2 children. Martha recognized her from earlier visits and noticed the hesitant way she approached the counter. Sarah held a small envelope in her hands, and as she reached the counter, she looked up, her cheeks flushed. "Miss Martha, I just wanted to thank you," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. She held out the envelope, which contained a few crumpled bills. "You helped me when I needed it most, and I've been saving up bit by bit to repay you. I know it's not much, but I just couldn't forget what you did for me." Martha smiled, feeling a swell of pride mixed with humility. She gently pushed the envelope back toward Sarah. "Sarah, you don't owe me anything," she said warmly. "Take that money and use it for your children. That's more than enough repayment for me." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes and she clasped Martha's hands tightly. "Thank you, Miss Martha. You'll never know how much this place means to us," she whispered. "You've made us feel like we're worth something, like we're not alone." As Sarah left with her children, Martha watched them go, her heart brimming with quiet joy. But her satisfaction was soon interrupted by the arrival of Rick, who had been standing nearby, silently observing the exchange. His expression was conflicted, as if he were grappling with something deep inside himself. Martha noticed and turned to face him, her eyes calm and expectant. "I don't understand you, Martha," Rick said, frustration and curiosity mingling in his voice. "People keep coming in here, taking things they can't pay for, and instead of demanding they pay up, you tell them to keep their money? How does that make any sense?" Martha studied Rick for a moment, sensing that this question held more weight than usual. She could see the skepticism in his eyes, but there was also a hint of something new, a genuine desire to understand. Taking a deep breath, she decided to share a part of her story she hadn't told anyone before. "Rick, there was a time when I was like these people," she began softly, her gaze turning distant as she recalled the past. "Years ago, when my daughter was young, I was barely scraping by. I was working 2 jobs, stretching every penny, and there were days when I didn't know if I'd be able to put food on the table. I remember going to a small store, much like this one, asking if I could buy just half of a loaf of bread because I couldn't afford the whole thing." Rick listened intently, his usual guarded expression giving way to curiosity. Martha continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "The owner looked at me, saw the struggle in my eyes, and without a word, he handed me the whole loaf and said, 'Pay me when you can.' I never forgot that kindness. It was a small thing, but it reminded me that there were people who cared, people who saw me as more than my circumstances. And now I want to do the same for others." Rick's face softened as her words sank in. For the first time, he seemed to see Martha not just as an idealist, but as a woman who had lived through hardship and come out stronger, her compassion born from real experience. He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair as he struggled to find the right words. I never knew," he said finally, his voice low. "I guess I always thought it was just business. You know, profits, numbers. I never thought about it like that." Martha smiled gently. Sometimes, Rick, business can be about more than numbers. Sometimes it's about people, about making a difference, even if it's just a small one. She paused, letting her words settle. And when you help someone, when you give them hope, that kindness has a way of coming back to you in ways you can't measure with money. Rick looked down, clearly moved. The cynicism that had once colored his view of the world seemed to waver, and for the first time, he looked at Martha with something like respect. It was as if a light had turned on within him, a new understanding dawning slowly but surely. He nodded, not fully convinced but more open than he had ever been. As they finished closing up the store for the night, Rick lingered, his usual hurried exit replaced by a quiet pause. "Maybe you're onto something, Martha," he murmured, almost to himself. "Maybe there's more to this than just making money." Martha smiled, patting him gently on the shoulder. "You'll see, Rick," she replied with a quiet certainty. "It might take time, but you'll see." And as they locked up and walked out into the cool evening, Martha felt a new hope growing inside her, not just for the store, but for the impact her choices were having on others. The seeds she had planted were taking root, spreading kindness and understanding, one small step at a time. And as she looked back at the store, its lights glowing softly in the night, she knew that her journey was far from over. There was still much work to do, and she was ready to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. As the months went on, the store became a vital part of the neighborhood in ways Martha had only dreamed of. Her gentle spirit and unwavering dedication to helping others transformed the place into a refuge, a beacon for anyone struggling to make ends meet or simply looking for kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. People from nearby communities began hearing about the store and Martha's unusual approach, and they came to see it for themselves, spreading the word further with each visit. One chilly morning, a local news reporter named Tom arrived at the store, a notepad in one hand and a camera slung over his shoulder. He introduced himself to Martha with a friendly smile, explaining that he'd heard about her store from a friend who had come in looking for a small discount and left with more than he'd expected, a sense of hope. Tom wanted to write a story about the store and its impact on the community, and he asked if he could interview Martha. Martha hesitated at first, not one for the spotlight, but the thought of sharing her message with a broader audience stirred something in her. She knew that the struggles she saw in her customers were the same struggles faced by countless others across the city. Maybe, she thought, her story could inspire others to bring kindness into their own businesses, their own lives. And so she agreed, offering Tom a seat behind the counter as she shared her story. As they spoke, customers came in and out, each one greeting Martha warmly. Some exchanged quick words of gratitude, while others lingered, listening as Martha explained her philosophy of community, dignity, and compassion. Tom listened closely, jotting down notes, clearly moved by her words. When she shared the story of the store owner who had once shown her kindness when she had been at her lowest, Tom's face softened with understanding. "It's a rare thing," he said almost to himself, "to see a business built on values like yours. Most places it's all about profit, bottom lines, and efficiency. But you've created something different here, Martha." Martha nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Kindness has a way of coming back around," she said simply. "It's not something you can put a price on, but it's worth more than anything money can buy. People need to know they're seen, that someone cares. It's a small thing, but sometimes it's enough to keep someone going." Tom looked around, taking in the worn but clean shelves, the handwritten sign by the door, the carefully arranged items that had been chosen with care and respect for the people who needed them most. It was clear to him that this was more than just a store. It was a lifeline, a sanctuary, a place where people could leave their burdens at the door, even if only for a little while. Before he left, Tom asked if he could take a few photos. Martha agreed, a bit shy about the attention, but willing if it meant her message would reach others. She stood by the counter as he snapped a few shots, capturing her warm smile and the humble surroundings that reflected her spirit. As Tom packed up his things, he shook her hand warmly, "Thank you, Martha," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "What you're doing here, it's inspiring. I think a lot of people will want to hear about it." After he left, the store returned to its usual rhythm. But Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something big was on the horizon. Over the next few days, customers mentioned the excitement of seeing her story in the paper, congratulating her on the well-deserved recognition. Martha smiled at their words, feeling both humbled and hopeful. Her store was no longer just a neighborhood secret. It was becoming a symbol of what was possible when a community rallied around compassion and generosity. When the article finally appeared, it was more than Martha could have imagined. The piece painted a vivid picture of the store, detailing not only Martha's journey, but the ripple effects her kindness had created within the neighborhood. There were stories from customers, young and old, families and singles, each one testifying to the difference Martha's store had made in their lives. The article ended with a powerful message. In a world that often forgets those who struggle, one woman reminds us that kindness is a currency that never loses its value. The story spread quickly, and soon people from all over the city began to visit, drawn by curiosity or simply the hope of experiencing a little bit of the warmth and humanity Martha had to offer. The store grew busier, and Rick, now working with a softened heart and a newfound respect for Martha's vision, found himself inspired by her example. He started greeting customers with a warmth he never knew he had, watching Martha's approach and adopting it in small, tentative ways. The store's new popularity brought fresh challenges, too. There were more demands on Martha's time, more customers in need, and more stock to manage. But each time Martha felt the weight of the work, she remembered the lives she had touched and the impact she was creating. Her purpose was clear, and she rose to the challenges with renewed energy, grateful for every opportunity to serve her community and spread a message of kindness. As she stood behind the counter one evening, looking out at the bustling store filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and the occasional heartfelt thank you, Martha felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any measure of success. She knew her journey wasn't finished, but she had come further than she had ever dreamed. She was building more than a business. She was building a legacy, one small act of kindness at a time. The weeks following the article's publication were a whirlwind. People from all over the city, and even from neighboring towns, came to visit Martha's store. Some arrived simply out of curiosity, but many came in search of the warmth and respect they'd read about. They wanted to experience a place where kindness was given as freely as a smile, and where people felt valued beyond what was in their wallets. Martha greeted each person with her usual warmth, learning new names, hearing new stories, and doing her best to extend her spirit of generosity to each visitor. The increased traffic, however, brought its own set of challenges. Martha found herself running low on stock more often, and her modest budget began to feel the strain. Prices from suppliers were higher due to demand, and though she wanted to keep her prices low, she worried that the financial pressure would eventually force her to compromise on her values. Even Rick, who had grown into a loyal supporter of her mission, voiced his concerns one afternoon. "Martha, we're getting more people in here than ever, and that's wonderful," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and worry. "But with all these new faces, we're running low on essentials. We might have to raise some prices to keep up, or we're going to struggle to stay afloat." Martha's heart sank. She knew he was right. The numbers were beginning to tell a story of their own, one that didn't align with her ideals. But just as she was about to respond, an idea sparked in her mind, one that felt as risky as it was hopeful. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully, "it's time to reach out to the community for support. We've helped so many people here, and I think they'd be willing to help us in return. Perhaps we can host a donation drive or ask for volunteers. It could be a way for everyone to contribute to keeping this place alive without raising prices." Rick looked at her, surprised but intrigued. "You really think people would help us out? I mean, I know they love what you've done here, but asking for donations is a big step." Martha nodded, her determination unwavering. "I believe they will. This place belongs to them as much as it belongs to me. They've seen what kindness can do, and if we ask for their help, I believe they'll come through. After all, we're all in this together." With renewed resolve, Martha crafted a plan. She put up a simple sign near the entrance, inviting the community to donate what they could, whether it was money, supplies, or even their time as volunteers. She explained that the store was facing challenges due to the increased demand, and that any support would help keep prices affordable and the doors open to everyone. To Martha's relief and joy, the response from the community was overwhelming. Within days, donations began to pour in. Small bills tucked into envelopes, bags of canned goods, basic supplies, even cleaning products and handmade items for the shelves. People who had been touched by Martha's kindness came forward eagerly, happy to give back in any way they could. Some families even offered to volunteer, spending their weekends stocking shelves, organizing goods, or greeting customers. The store took on a life of its own, with everyone pitching in to keep it running. One Saturday, the store held a community gathering to thank everyone who had contributed. The small space was packed with people, each one filled with a shared pride and purpose. There were tables set up with baked goods made by local families, handmade crafts, and even a small donation jar for those who wanted to contribute a little more. Martha, seeing the store filled with such warmth and generosity, felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't just built a store, she had helped create a community bound together by kindness. At the event, Martha gave a short speech, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying a tenderness that silenced the room. "This store isn't just mine. It belongs to each of you. It's a place where we remind each other that no one is alone and everyone matters. I couldn't do any of this without you, and I want you to know how much your kindness means to me. Together we've created something truly special." The crowd responded with applause, many of them wiping away tears. Rick, who stood nearby, clapped along with everyone else. His face softened with pride and respect. He had witnessed firsthand the transformation of not only the store, but also of himself. He had gone from being a skeptical employee to someone who genuinely believed in Martha's vision. Watching the joy and togetherness filling the store, he realized that he too had found a place within this community, something he'd never thought possible. As the gathering continued, Martha mingled with her guests, sharing hugs, laughter, and stories. People came up to her, expressing their gratitude, each story building on the next. An elderly woman shared how the store's support had helped her during a time of illness. A young father told her how her kindness had given him strength when he was between jobs. Each person carried a piece of Martha's mission forward, turning her simple acts of compassion into something larger than she had ever dreamed. As the evening came to a close, Martha stood by the entrance, watching the last of her guests leave, their faces glowing with happiness and a shared sense of purpose. The store, though modest, was filled with an energy she could hardly describe. It had become a place where strangers became friends, where burdens were lifted, and where the heart of a community beat stronger with each passing day. When she finally closed the doors, Martha took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The shelves were still stocked, the donations and contributions overflowing, but it was the spirit of the place that touched her most deeply. This store was no longer just a place for transactions. It was a space for transformation, where people felt seen, supported, and cared for. It was, in every sense, the home she had always longed to build for herself and others. And in that moment, she felt a sense of peace that filled her soul, knowing that this was only the beginning. In the weeks following the community gathering, Martha's store became a symbol of hope across the city. People continued to travel from near and far, bringing with them stories, donations, and even their own skills to support her mission. The donations were generous, but it was the personal involvement of the community that made the difference. Local artists volunteered to decorate the store with murals, adding color and life to the walls. Musicians offered to perform on weekends, turning the store into a lively spot filled with laughter, music, and joy. Each person who entered brought a unique piece of themselves, and soon the store reflected the diversity and spirit of the entire community. One morning, As Martha was arranging flowers on a display table near the entrance, she was greeted by an unexpected visitor. The man who had once owned the store, Mr. Gibbons. He looked around, clearly surprised by the changes, the warmth, and the bustling atmosphere that filled the space. Martha felt a wave of emotions as she watched him take in the scene, wondering what had brought him back. "Martha," he began, nodding slowly as he approached her. "I never thought I'd see this place like this. When I sold it to you, I figured it would just fade away like so many places around here. But you've turned it into something remarkable." Martha looked at him, her face gentle but resolute. "It was never just about the store, Mr. Gibbons," she replied softly. "It was about the people. They needed a place where they could feel safe, respected, and valued. And all I did was listen." Mr. Gibbons nodded, clearly moved. After a pause, he extended his hand. "Well, I'm glad you did, Martha. This place is better than anything I could have imagined." Martha shook his hand, feeling a quiet sense of closure. She knew that the store's success went beyond her own efforts. It was the community, the people who believed in her vision, who had made it all possible. She watched Mr. Gibbons leave, grateful that even he could see the impact of what they had built together. As she went back to work, she noticed Rick watching her from behind the counter, a thoughtful expression on his face. The past few months had softened him, and his initial skepticism had all but disappeared. He walked over to her, clearing his throat as if preparing to say something important. "Martha," he began, "I wanted to thank you for everything. I came here thinking I knew how a store should be run, how business was supposed to work. But you taught me that sometimes it's about more than the bottom line. You've changed the way I see things and, well, you've changed me." Martha smiled, touched by his words. "Rick, you've been a big part of this too. It's not just me, it's all of us. You've worked hard, and you've learned to see people with compassion. That's no small thing." Rick nodded, his face breaking into a rare smile. "I'm glad I stayed. I think I found something here that I didn't know I was looking for." They shared a quiet moment of understanding, each of them feeling the deep connection that had grown between them through their shared journey. Rick turned back to the counter, and Martha looked out at the store, her heart full. On a bright, clear morning, Martha arrived early to the store. She took a moment to stand outside, looking at the building that had once been a small, neglected space and was now a beloved part of the community. The sign, "Everyone Deserves Dignity," hung proudly by the door, weathered by time but shining with a meaning that only grew stronger each day. As she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar hum of the store coming to life. Volunteers had already begun setting up, and a few early customers wandered in, exchanging greetings and smiles. The store had become a hub for the entire neighborhood, a place where people knew they were valued, where no one was turned away, and where every act of kindness was celebrated. By mid-morning, the store was bustling. People were buying groceries, picking up fresh flowers, and gathering around the tables that had been set up for the day's community event, a small celebration in honor of the store and everything it had brought to their lives. Martha moved among them, listening, laughing, sharing hugs and conversations, each person reinforcing the purpose she had found in this space. Toward the end of the day, as the crowd began to thin out, Martha took a seat by the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had become her family. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the difficult years, the sacrifices, the quiet moments of resilience that had sustained her when things were hard. She felt a deep gratitude for everything that had led her to this moment. As she sat there, a young girl approached her, a child who often came in with her mother and who had grown attached to Martha's gentle presence. She climbed onto the seat beside Martha and looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Miss Martha, when I grow up, I want to have a store just like yours," she said, her voice bright with admiration. Martha smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her heart. She placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "You know what, sweetheart? You already have everything you need to make that happen. Just remember to treat people with kindness and respect, and they'll give it back to you in ways you can't imagine." The girl nodded, her face serious as she took in Martha's words, and then ran off to join her mother. Martha watched her go, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She knew that her journey had come full circle, that she had built something lasting, something that would continue even after she was gone. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the store, Martha stood up, feeling the strength and wisdom that had carried her this far. Her store, her life, and her legacy were all woven into the fabric of the community. Each small act of kindness creating a chain that would continue to grow, connecting people long after she was gone. With a final look at the bustling store and the smiling faces around her, Martha felt the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. She had taken a simple, struggling store and transformed it into something beautiful, something meaningful. And as she closed up for the night, she knew that the story of her store, her community, and her kindness was only just beginning.